The saloon sat hushed in that hour between whiskey and dust, when the sunlight streaming through the slatted shutters turned golden as cornmeal, and the piano stood closed and still, lit like a coffin in state. Outside, the wind meandered down Main Street, soft as breath, lifting dry petals from a forgotten bouquet someone had left beside the church steps morning. Something no one dared to name. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood, cigar smoke, and the weight of things unsaid. In the far corner, Gideon Hart sat alone, just as he always had, nursing a glass of rye he never finished. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, revealing forearms browned and corded with years of silent labor. He was the kind of man people didn't approach more than once. His silence had substance, density, like it was crowded with ghosts. He never faced the door, but that day, for reasons he couldn't have named, he did, and so he saw her. The saloon doors swung wide, letting in a sudden shaft of clean light and the faint exhale of the world beyond. A girl stepped through, no taller than a sad lahorn, her bare feet dusted from the road, her hair the color of river mud tied back into uneven braids. Her dress was thin, faded, patched at the elbows, and in her hand she clutched a crumpled paper, its edges frayed like it had been opened and refolded 100 times. She stood blinking against the dim interior, as though squinting through a memory. Then her eyes found Gideon. "P," she said softly, like a secret, but it dropped into the silence with the weight of a stone in still water. The room paused. A chair scraped faintly. Someone gave a nervous chuckle, and then fell quiet again. Gideon didn't move, didn't blink. He just stared at the child the way a man might stare at a photograph he's never seen, but swears he knows. Her eyes, green, bright, utterly unafraid, held his. She clutched the paper tighter and stepped forward. "Are you my Pa, Ezra?" The old bartender, whose hearing came and went like rain on a tin roof, leaned in like he'd misheard. A snort from the preacher's boy echoed by the stove, and a card player let his hand fall with a curse. But Gideon still said nothing. His jaw tightened. Then the doors burst open once more. A woman staggered inside, breathless and desperate. Her frame was too thin, her eyes hollowed by years that didn't match her age. 27, maybe, though she wore it like 100. Her dress was soaked from the knees down, hair pinned in a loose knot that had long since given up the fight. She looked like a woman who'd walked through every storm life could conjure, and somehow was still walking. She reached for the girl's hand firmly, but without cruelty. "You don't talk to strangers, baby," she murmured, though her voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "But Mama," the child said. "He looks just like the drawing." "SHH," Mabel Quinn said quickly. She turned to face the room, chin lifted, eyes daring the judgment she knew was already gathering like clouds. Then, with the kind of pride that's carried in bones rather than words, she turned and led her daughter out. The saloon doors creaked, shut behind them. Gideon hadn't moved. Someone coughed. A few murmurs rose like steam. The piano man cleared his throat, fingers twitching toward the keys, but the spell was too thick, too present. Gideon rose, slow, as if even his joints questioned the decision. He left the glass untouched, walked to the batwing doors, and pushed them open. Outside, the sun burned clean and sharp. Down the street, he saw Mabel stoop to tie the girl's bootless, the child still holding her drawing like it was a shield against the world. Gideon stepped onto the porch. She sensed him and looked up. "You dropped this," he said, holding out a faded bonnet she hadn't realized she'd lost. Mabel hesitated, then stepped forward to take it. Their fingers brushed. Her eyes, still blue, still rimmed with too many yesterdays, met his. "I'm sorry," she said. "She don't know better. I ain't her father," he said at last, his voice low and even. "I know," she whispered. Her eyes darted down the road. "But she doesn't. She's just tired. We've been walking a long while." "You got people?" he asked, voice like gravel worn smooth. "No," she said, her jaw tightening. "Not anymore," he nodded. Once and turned, heading back into the shadows of the saloon. That night, the wind howled across the plains like a woman mourning. In his cabin, Gideon lit the old oil lamp and sat beside the cold stove. The walls moaned beneath the weight of memory. He reached beneath the cot and pulled out a box he hadn't opened in years. Inside lay a small, wooden horse worn smooth. By time, carved one winter when his wife told him they'd never have children. She said she didn't mind, said the Lord had other plans, said all the right things until the sickness took her before spring. He placed the horse on the windowsill and watched lightning arc across the hills. He didn't sleep. The next morning, the preacher refused Mabel's shelter in the mission house, called the girl illegitimate, said it would set a bad example, just like men who hid behind Scripture and never asked where their own sins wandered after dark. The saloon offered their barn barely. Mabel accepted with a nod that asked nothing. Leah curled against her mother like a pup beside an old stove. Gideon watched it all from across the street. He didn't speak, didn't move, but something in him shifted. That night, he left a folded blanket and a biscuits on a crate by the barn door. He was gone before she found them. The following night, the blanket returned clean, neatly folded, tied with a ribbon. Days passed. One morning, Mabel walked Leah past his porch. The child waved. He didn't wave back, but he did set a red apple on the step where she could see it. She beamed, darted to grab it, bit deep. Mabel didn't speak, but her eyes softened just slightly. It became a rhythm and unspoken exchange, food, warmth, glances that held quiet meaning, but never reached the mouth. One afternoon, with snow drifting low through the streets, Leah crawled beneath Gideon's porch and began to draw. She hummed as she sketched with a piece of charcoal. When he stepped outside, she didn't startle. "Drawing?" he asked. "It's our house," she said proudly. "Mama lives there." "Me, too. You're there." "To see." She pointed to a stick figure holding hands with two smaller ones. Gideon crouched, knees cracking, studying the crooked lines and the smile she'd given him. "I ain't your paw," he said again. She looked up. "You sure act like him." He opened his mouth, then closed it, reached into his coat and pulled out a smooth stone he'd once carved with a heart he didn't even remember why. He placed it beside her drawing. "Keep that," he said. She smiled. "You're real nice, mister." He turned and walked back inside. That night, Gideon dreamed of laughter. Not loud, but soft. Near a hearth, a small hand reached for his across a table. He woke with a tear buried in his beard. The snow thickened. The nights hardened. One morning, the town watched Leah coughing into her mother's shawl. The doctor refused credit. Mabel walked out with her head high, child in arms. By sundown, Gideon had ridden to the doctor's porch. "Only bill me," he said. Back at the barn, Mabel's face was pale from the cold. Gideon dismounted. "You'll freeze in there," he said. She looked up. "You and the girl. Come stay the night. I got space." She hesitated. "Folks will talk." "They already do," he said. She bit her lip, looked at her daughter, and nodded once. That night, she tucked Leah into the bed Gideon hadn't used since the world ended. She curled up on the floor. Gideon sat by the fire, watching logs collapse into ember. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He was silent for a long time. Then, "I don't know." She turned to him. "She's never had a paw, but she's always believed she will." His eyes stayed fixed on the fire. "Maybe she already has," she whispered. He didn't answer. But when he rose and stepped onto the porch, he paused. Behind him, Mabel stared at the sleeping girl, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. And Gideon Hart, barren, widowed, broken, turned to see the drawing Leah had pinned to the wall. 3 figures holding hands, all smiling. He didn't tear it down. Outside, the storm had stilled. And in that hush, the snow began to fall. Dry Creek Hollow remembered what it should have forgotten. Its scandals clung like coal soot long after the flames were gone. Gossip traveled faster than the wind, and reputations once cracked never truly healed. Spring came late that year, muddy, uncertain, with snow still curled in the shadows of fences, and through it, Mabel Quinn lived as quietly as she could. But Dry Creek noticed. It always did. She rose before the mission bell, walked Leah to the pump behind the church, scrubbed their dresses with rough soap and cold rainwater. The child laughed at the chill. Mabel hushed her, eyes flicking to the preacher's window. Leah didn't yet understand that some places only showed kindness to the clean, the quiet, and the properly born. When they stepped into the general store for flour, The hush fell again. Eyes turned. A jar clinked on the counter. "Quarter sack, please," Mabel said. Old Mr. Jennings didn't look up. "We're fresh out." She glanced at the full sacks behind him. "You sure? Come back next week," he muttered. She didn't argue, just turned, lifted Leia onto her hip, and walked out into the wind. Gideon stood outside, watching. His fingers gripped the reins, his jaw tighter still, but he said nothing. He watched her walk like her spine was carved from timber, like the world would have to break her to make her bend. That afternoon, Leia's cough deepened behind the barn, a dry, rattling sound. Mabel whispered to her, "Wrap the shawl tighter." From the loft, someone whispered, "That child's gonna die if she don't get proper shelter." But no one offered it. That night, Gideon left another parcel: boiled eggs, a tin of stew, and a small bar of soap. He never knocked, never spoke. It was the closest thing to prayer he'd ever managed. Mabel found it at sundown. She held the soap like it was gold. By morning, the parcel had returned clean, folded, and laid on the same faded blue blanket. No note, just silence, and still, the town whispered. Whispers grew into fire, and fire always demanded something to burn. That evening, she placed a tin cup at the seat where he'd been. No thank you, just acknowledgement. That was how they communicated now, through objects, glances, and gestures that bore the weight of entire histories. The night dipped cold again. On one of those nights, when the wind snapped against the shutters and Leia whimpered in her sleep, Mabel emerged from the smaller room, blanket in hand. She laid it gently over the girl who had kicked hers off. Then, turning, she found Gideon in the doorway, shirt loose at the collar, hair damp from a recent wash. He didn't say anything, neither did she. As she passed him, her shoulder brushed his accidentally. Or perhaps not, and she returned to her bed without another glance. Come morning, there was a bundle of firewood neatly stacked at her door. The edges were split clean, precise. Mabel smiled and made cornbread for breakfast. When Gideon bit into it and gave a nod, she commented, "More salt next time." Whatever he replied was too soft to catch, but the corners of his mouth lifted just enough to resemble something like a smile. They never named what was building between them, never dared call it family. Yet each night, Mabel added a pinch of wild mint to the beans. Gideon began smoothing Leia's hair when she passed. Leia started setting 3 places at the table, always placing the little carved wooden horse in the center. The horse never moved, as if it too belonged. One morning, Gideon took Leia out to the fence and taught her how to saddle the mare. "Like this," he said, lifting her onto the low rail so she could see. "You don't rush a horse. You speak with your hands, like Mama does when she's mad but doesn't talk." Leia's eyes grew wide. "Like that?" He gave a dry chuckle. "Something like that." She copied his movements, small fingers fumbling at the cinch. "Can I ride her someday?" "Someday," he answered, tightening the strap gently. "When she knows you won't break." From the porch, Mabel watched, arms crossed against the morning breeze, her expression unreadable, but her eyes shimmered like wet stone. Later that day, Leia presented Gideon with a drawing: a house, a woman in a dress, a man with a beard, and a little girl holding both their hands. Scrawled above it in shaky letters were the words, "Our place." He took it with the gravity of someone, handed a letter from the dead, held it too long, then tucked it gently into the mirror frame by the door. That night, after Leia had drifted off to sleep, Mabel approached the hearth where Gideon sat mending a leather strap. "You're kind to her," she said, voice low. "She makes it easy." She hesitated. "I used to be afraid of men like you." He didn't glance up. "Like me, quiet ones, the kind who carry pain in one hand, but offer help with the other." He tied a knot in the leather, precise, practiced. "And now?" she asked, her voice barely a thread. "Now," she said, "I think you might be the only kind I trust." His eyes found hers then. The fire caught in both of them. Neither flinched. They held the look for a long time, no words offered to define what stirred between them. A few days later, a wagon arrived from town. It brought sugar, flour, nails, and a note from the preacher. "There's talk. Tread carefully. Your choices cast longer shadows than you think." Gideon read it, then fed it to the stove without a word. Mabel saw the smoke. noticed the tension in his jaw, but didn't press. Instead, she sewed a button back onto his coat. Her fingers brushed the fabric like it mattered more than it did. When he said, "Thank you," she replied, "You're welcome," in a tone that sounded dangerously close to a promise. Leia grew stronger with each passing day. Her cheeks pinked with health. Her laughter returned in full, ringing out into the trees behind the cabin. One afternoon, she brought home a frog in her apron, insisting it sleep in a box beside her bed. Gideon fashioned a lid with holes. Mabel rolled her eyes but added a lettuce leaf anyway. It felt like something had finally settled, like maybe they could keep it. But peace, especially in a place like Dry Creek, never stayed long. It was dusk when Gideon saw the rider. He came alone, lean and slouched in a weathered saddle. Dust clung to him like a second skin, and the way he moved entitled, expectant, made Gideon's hand twitch near the shotgun behind the door. The man didn't approach. He rode the edge of the property, then vanished into the tree line. Gideon didn't speak of it that night, but Mabel noticed how his silence thickened again. Leia didn't. The next morning, Gideon checked the barn locks twice, fed the animals early, and chopped more wood than usual. When Mabel asked, all he said was, "It's nothing." At supper, he didn't eat. "Was it him?" she asked, quietly. "I don't know yet." Her voice tightened. "I always knew he might come. If he does, I'll leave." She whispered, "I won't let him take this from you." Gideon looked at her slowly. "You think this was given to me?" She shook her head, hands trembling. "I think it was earned." Leia sat watching from across the table, puzzled by the grown-up quiet. "You can't fight every storm." "Gideon," Mabel whispered. "I don't need to fight," he answered. "Just stand long enough for it to pass." She reached across the table and touched his hand. "And if I ask you not to stand alone?" He looked at her fingers, calloused, clean. "I wouldn't know how to ask you to stay." "You don't have to." The next day, Mabel sewed a new curtain for the front window. Leia helped, tangling thread and giggling. Gideon hung it at sundown. The house felt changed, less like waiting, more like living. Still, the wind that night carried a strange silence. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a man dismounted, laid a hand on a pistol worn smooth by time and bitterness. Dust and the scent of horses rode the air. By midday the next morning, the sun already leaned hot, sweat clinging to the skin. Gideon stood by the trough, wiping his brow with a rag that smelled of leather and would smoke. He paused mid-motion. A figure was approaching, steady, slow, like a man who had already decided how this ended. Mabel stepped out onto the porch, her dress caught in a breeze that offered no comfort. She didn't have to ask who it was. Leland Pike dismounted with calculated ease. Everything about him, the loose posture, the sharp eyes, the silver chain at his throat, spoke of someone who enjoyed being watched. His revolver was slung low. His smirk curled like smoke. Well, he said. "Ain't this cozy?" Gideon didn't move. His voice was low. "You've got no business here." "I reckon I've got all kinds," Leland said, scanning the homestead, looking for a woman who left a debt unpaid. Mabel stepped down from the porch, not toward him, but toward Leia. The girl was drawing with a piece of coal. Her small hand slipped into her mother's. "You leave her out of this," Mabel said, her voice calm but taut. Leland clicked his tongue. "Always were proud, May, even with no cause. Man feeds you, gives you shelter, and you sneak off like a thief." "She's not property," Gideon said, stepping forward. "She signed papers that said she owed me." Leland snapped. "Did you bring them?" Leland laughed. "Didn't need to. I brought memory." Mabel's voice trembled, not with fear, but something older. "I was 17. You promised wages. You gave bruises. You want memory? My hip still hurts when it rains." Leland's grin turned cruel. "You ran. That broke contract." "She's not going with you," Gideon said. "You got a stake in this now?" Leland asked. "I do." Leland spat. "You going to draw on me? Overused goods." The words struck Mabel like a slap, but she didn't drop Leia's hand. "She's not damaged," Gideon said. "Then why she got nothing? No name, no papers, just a brat with someone else's eyes." "I believe her." "That's sweet," Leland said. "But belief don't change fact. I'll be back tomorrow. Either she comes peaceful, or you make a mistake you won't recover from." He tipped his head at Leia. Cute kid. Shame. He rode away, leaving only dust behind, and a silence that didn't clear. Inside, Mabel sat stiffly. I should go, she whispered. Double quotes. No. They'll come back, and if you're not here, maybe they don't bother. You think he'll stop if I run again? I think. Gideon said, kneeling before her. I've been hurt before. But this feels worth hurting for. I can't give you everything, she said. I can give you my name, my land, my protection. I don't want saving. I want to stop surviving. Then stay. She did, that night. He oiled the hinges and laid Buckshot by the window. He said nothing. She knew. At dawn, Leia crawled into his cot, curled against him like she'd always done. He hesitated, then wrapped his arm around her. No riders came the next day, nor the day after. But on the third morning, bootprints appeared near the barn. Leia's drawing, once pinned to the porch, was gone. In its place sat a bullet, upright, waiting. By noon, Mabel was in the garden. Leia played nearby. The air smelled of soil and storm. Then came the hoof beats. 3 horses. Gideon walked inside, picked up the shotgun, and stepped out again. He stood not as a challenge, but as a mountain stands. UNMOVING. Leland returned. 2 men flanked him, armed, paid for uglier things. You had time, Leland called. I'm done waiting. She's not going with you, Mabel said, stepping out. She's inside, and she stays. Leland's grin vanished. Then we do this the hard way. He moved fast. Too fast. The rifleman raised his weapon. Gideon fired. The first man dropped, wounded and cursing. Leland charged. Gideon met him head on. They clashed bone and blood. Gideon's ribs cracked under Leland's blows, but he didn't fall. He twisted the pistol from Leland's hand and knocked him down. Mabel screamed. The second man raised his rifle. Mabel ran, grabbed the shotgun. Click. Empty. But it was enough. The man fled. Gideon stood over Leland, bloodied, breathing hard. You. Come back. I don't spare you. You're just a broken man, Leland spat. No, Gideon said. I'm a man who stayed, and that made all the difference. Later, inside, Mabel wiped blood from his temple. You didn't have to. I did. I would again. That night, the house smelled of stew. Leia curled against Gideon, safe. Mabel sat across from him. There's something I want, she said. Name it. I want to stay. Then this is your home. She hesitated. I want your name. He rose, walked to her side, and knelt not for show, but in gravity. Then, take it, he said. It's yours. She covered her mouth. Nodded. Laya climbed onto his lap. I told you he was my paw. Outside, the wind shifted. Stars blinked awake. And beyond the ridge, the preacher watched, not angry, just curious.